On May 1st, 1945, as Soviet shells rained down on the burning ruins of Berlin, a man walked out of the Führer bunker and vanished into history. He was not a minor functionary or a low-ranking officer trying to save his skin. He was Heinrich Müller, the head of the Gestapo, the most feared secret police organization the world had ever seen. He was one of the most powerful men in Nazi Germany, the man who had overseen the arrest, torture, and murder of countless thousands. He had personally coordinated the logistics of the Holocaust. He had hunted resistance fighters across occupied Europe. He had crushed dissent with an iron fist for over a decade. And then, in the chaos of Berlin's final hours, he simply disappeared. No body was ever found. No credible witness ever reported his death. No grave has ever been confirmed. For nearly 80 years, historians, Nazi hunters, intelligence agencies, and conspiracy theorists have searched for answers. What happened to Heinrich Müller? Did he die in the rubble of Berlin, as some claimed? Did he escape through the ratlines to South America like so many other Nazis? Did he defect to the Soviet Union, offering his expertise to Stalin's secret police? Or did he slip into a new identity somewhere in the West, living out his days in quiet anonymity while the world hunted for ghosts? The mystery of Heinrich Müller is one of the greatest unsolved puzzles of World War II. He was the highest-ranking Nazi official whose fate was never definitively established. He was a man who knew more secrets than almost anyone in the Third Reich. He was a professional at making people disappear. And in the end, he used those skills on himself. This is the story of the Gestapo chief who vanished. A story of terror, secrets, and a disappearance that has haunted history for generations. To understand the mystery of Müller's disappearance, we first need to understand who he was and why he mattered. Heinrich Müller was born on April 28, 1900 in Munich, Bavaria. His background was thoroughly ordinary. His father was a Catholic police official, and young Heinrich seemed destined for a similar career in law enforcement. He was not an intellectual or an ideologue. He was not drawn to grand theories about race or politics. He was something potentially more dangerous. He was a bureaucrat who was exceptionally good at his job and utterly indifferent to the moral implications of what that job required. Müller served as a pilot in World War I, earning the Iron Cross for his service. After the war, he joined the Bavarian police and began building a reputation as a skilled investigator and administrator. He specialized in tracking left-wing political movements, particularly communists. He was methodical, thorough, and relentless. He built extensive files on suspected radicals. He developed networks of informants. He learned how to break down suspects through interrogation. These skills would later be applied on a much larger and more horrifying scale. Here is something remarkable about Heinrich Müller. He was not originally a Nazi. In fact, he actively worked against the Nazi Party during its early years. As a Bavarian police officer in the 1920s and early 1930s, Müller monitored and suppressed Nazi activities just as he suppressed communist activities. He was a servant of the state, whoever controlled that state. He had no particular ideology beyond efficiency and obedience. When the Nazis came to power in 1933, Müller simply transferred his loyalty to the new regime. His expertise in surveillance and political repression was too valuable to waste on ideological purity tests. This lack of early Nazi commitment actually worked against Müller for a time. True believers in the party were suspicious of this policeman who had once tracked their movements. Reinhard Heydrich, the ruthless head of the SS security service, was initially reluctant to promote Müller precisely because of his late conversion to the cause. But Müller's sheer competence overcame these objections. He was simply too good at what he did to be sidelined. By 1939, he had risen to become the head of the Gestapo, the Geheime Staatspolizei, the secret state police that would become synonymous with Nazi terror. Under Müller's leadership, the Gestapo became a machine of unprecedented efficiency and repression. The organization had relatively few actual agents, perhaps 30,000 at its peak for a population of over 80 million Germans. But Müller built a system that multiplied this force many times over. He cultivated networks of informants in every neighborhood, every workplace, every apartment building. He encouraged Germans to denounce each other for the slightest sign of disloyalty. He created an atmosphere of fear so pervasive that people censored themselves, afraid that any word spoken carelessly might reach Gestapo ears. Müller personally oversaw interrogations of high-value prisoners. He was present when members of resistance groups were broken through torture. He reviewed files and signed orders that sent thousands to concentration camps. He was not a sadist who enjoyed inflicting pain. He was something colder. He was a professional who viewed human suffering as simply a tool for achieving results. Survivors of Gestapo interrogation described Müller as calm, methodical, and utterly without empathy. He asked questions. He noted answers. He applied pressure until he got what he wanted. Then he moved on to the next file. Müller's role in the Holocaust was central, though he operated in the shadows rather than in the spotlight. He coordinated with Adolf Eichmann, who handled the logistics of deportation, to ensure that Jews across occupied Europe were efficiently rounded up and transported to the death camps. He tracked down Jews in hiding. He crushed resistance movements that tried to help them escape. He ensured that the machinery of genocide operated smoothly. When the war crimes tribunals later tried to document Nazi atrocities, Müller's signature appeared on countless damning documents. He was not the architect of the Holocaust in the way that Himmler or Heydrich were. He was something equally essential. He was the implementer, the administrator who turned murderous ideology into murderous reality. Throughout the war, Müller also ran counterintelligence operations against Allied spy networks. He was responsible for catching enemy agents, turning double agents, and feeding disinformation back to the Allies. He supervised the investigation after the July 20, 1944 assassination attempt against Hitler, personally overseeing the torture of suspected conspirators to extract names and details. Hundreds of people were executed as a result of information gathered under his direction. He was, in short, one of the most dangerous men in Nazi Germany. A man who knew where all the bodies were buried because he had helped bury many of them himself. Now let us turn to the final days of the Third Reich and the mystery that would follow. By April 1945, the war was clearly lost. Allied forces were closing in from all directions. The Soviet Red Army was fighting street by street through Berlin. Hitler had retreated to his underground bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery, surrounded by a shrinking circle of loyalists. Heinrich Müller was among them. Unlike many Nazi officials who fled Berlin as the situation deteriorated, Müller stayed at his post until the very end. This was consistent with his character. He was a man who followed orders and maintained discipline regardless of circumstances. He continued coordinating Gestapo operations even as the organization crumbled around him. He burned documents that might incriminate himself and others. He maintained contact with whatever remained of his networks across the collapsing Reich. On April 30, 1945, Adolf Hitler committed suicide in his bunker. His new wife, Eva Braun, died beside him. Their bodies were burned in the Chancellery Garden as Soviet shells continued to fall. The next day, May 1st, Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda minister, poisoned his 6 children and then had himself and his wife shot by an SS orderly. The bunker was becoming a tomb. Those who remained faced a choice: surrender to the Soviets and face likely execution or brutal imprisonment. Try to escape through Soviet lines to reach American or British forces who might treat them more mercifully, or die in the ruins of Berlin. Heinrich Müller chose to disappear. The last confirmed sightings of Müller place him in the bunker complex on May 1st, 1945. According to witnesses, he was still functioning as Gestapo chief even in those final hours, receiving reports and issuing orders. At some point during the night of May 1st or the early morning of May 2nd, he left the bunker. And then there is nothing. No confirmed sightings, no body, no grave. Nothing but rumors, theories, and unanswered questions. What makes Müller's disappearance so extraordinary is that he was one of the most wanted men in the world. The Allied powers were actively hunting major Nazi war criminals. Müller's name was on every list. His photograph was distributed to occupation forces across Europe. Intelligence agencies from multiple countries were searching for him. The newly formed Nation of Israel, created in 1948, made finding Nazi war criminals a national priority. Simon Wiesenthal, the famous Nazi hunter, devoted resources to tracking Müller. And yet, despite all these efforts, spanning decades and involving some of the most sophisticated intelligence operations in history, Heinrich Müller was never found. Let us examine the various theories about what happened to him. Each theory has its advocates and its evidence. Each also has significant problems. The truth, if it is ever discovered, may be stranger than any of them. The first and simplest theory is that Müller died in Berlin during the final battle for the city. This was the official position of the West German government for many years. According to this theory, Müller was killed either by Soviet fire or by his own hand during the chaotic final hours. His body was simply never identified among the thousands of corpses that littered the ruined city. This theory has some support. A body identified as Müller's was supposedly buried in a mass grave at a Jewish cemetery in Berlin in 1945. In 1963, West German authorities exhumed the grave to try to confirm the identification. What they found was confusing. The grave contained multiple bodies, none of which could be definitively identified as Müller. Some skeletal remains were examined, but the results were inconclusive. The forensic technology of the time was limited compared to what we have today. The problem with the death in Berlin theory is that it relies on negative evidence. No one actually saw Müller die. No one identified his body at the time. The burial records were chaotic and unreliable. And Müller was precisely the kind of man who would have had escape plans prepared. He had spent his entire career planning for contingencies and covering his tracks. It seems unlikely that such a man would simply allow himself to be killed or captured without attempting to escape. The second major theory is that Müller escaped to South America through the infamous ratlines. These were escape routes organized by various groups, including some Catholic clergy and former SS networks, that helped Nazi war criminals flee Europe after the war. Thousands of Nazis used these routes to reach Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Paraguay, and other South American countries. Adolf Eichmann, Müller's close colleague in administering the Holocaust, escaped this way and lived in Argentina for 15 years before being captured by Israeli agents in 1960. Josef Mengele, the angel of death of Auschwitz, escaped through ratlines and lived in South America until his death by drowning in 1979. If these men could escape, why not Müller? There have been numerous reported sightings of Müller in South America over the years. Witnesses claim to have seen him in Argentina, in Brazil, in Chile, in Panama. Some reports placed him living under an assumed name, perhaps running a business or living in quiet retirement. Nazi hunters investigated many of these leads. Most turned out to be cases of mistaken identity or deliberate disinformation. A few remained tantalizing but unconfirmed. The problem is that Müller's face was less distinctive than some other Nazi leaders. He looked like what he was, an ordinary middle-aged German bureaucrat. Such a man could disappear into almost any German immigrant community in South America without attracting attention. One particularly intriguing version of the South America theory involves a connection to American intelligence. Some researchers have suggested that Müller was recruited by the CIA or its predecessor organization, the OSS, after the war. According to this theory, Müller offered his extensive knowledge of Soviet intelligence methods in exchange for protection and a new identity. The Americans, facing the emerging Cold War threat, decided that Müller's expertise was too valuable to waste on war crimes trials. They smuggled him out of Europe and set him up somewhere safe, possibly in South America, possibly even in the United States itself. This theory is not as far-fetched as it might sound. The American intelligence community did recruit former Nazis with useful skills after the war. Operation Paperclip brought German scientists, including some with Nazi connections, to work on American rocket and weapons programs. The Gehlen Organization, a West German intelligence agency funded by the CIA, was staffed largely by former Nazi intelligence officers. The Americans were willing to overlook war crimes when it served their Cold War interests. Could they have made a deal with Heinrich Müller? There is circumstantial evidence that supports this possibility. In 2001, the CIA declassified documents related to its investigations of Müller. These documents revealed that the agency had received multiple reports placing Müller in various locations after the war. Some reports suggested he was alive and living under protection. The CIA investigated these leads but never reached a definitive conclusion. The documents also revealed that the agency was actively interested in Müller's fate, which suggests they were not certain he was dead. However, no smoking gun has ever emerged. No document definitively proves that Müller worked for American intelligence. The theory remains plausible but unproven. The third major theory is perhaps the most disturbing. According to this theory, Heinrich Müller defected to the Soviet Union after the war. He offered his expertise in secret police methods to Stalin's NKVD, the Soviet equivalent of the Gestapo. The Soviets, who had their own massive apparatus of repression, welcomed this expert in surveillance, interrogation, and political control. Müller spent the rest of his life in Moscow, training Soviet agents and advising on security matters. This theory has several points in its favor. Müller was, as we have noted, not an ideological Nazi. He was a professional policeman who served whoever was in power. He had spent years studying communist methods before the Nazis came to power. He understood how such systems worked. He would have been a valuable asset to the Soviets. Furthermore, the Soviets did recruit former Nazis after the war, particularly those with useful skills. They were no more scrupulous than the Americans about war crimes when their interests were at stake. There are also some intriguing pieces of evidence. Soviet forces captured the Reich main security office, including many Gestapo files when they took Berlin. They would have had extensive documentation of Müller's activities and capabilities. Some researchers have noted that Soviet records on Müller are suspiciously sparse, as if information about him was deliberately suppressed. A few defectors from Soviet intelligence have claimed secondhand that Müller was brought to Moscow after the war. But none of these claims have been definitively verified. The Soviet defection theory also has problems. Müller had spent his career hunting communists. He was responsible for the deaths of many Soviet agents and sympathizers. Would the Soviets really trust such a man? Would they welcome into their inner circles someone who had been their deadly enemy? It seems risky, even by the standards of Cold War espionage. And if Müller did defect to the Soviets, why has no definitive proof emerged since the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991? Russian archives have been partially opened. Former Soviet officials have written memoirs. If Müller lived out his life in Moscow, someone should know about it. There are other theories, more speculative still. Some researchers believe Müller escaped to the Middle East, possibly to Egypt or Syria, where other Nazi fugitives found refuge and sometimes worked as advisors to Arab governments. Some believe he went to Spain, which under Francisco Franco provided sanctuary to many former Nazis. A few fringe theories suggest even more exotic possibilities. That Müller was killed by his own subordinates who wanted to cover their tracks. That he was captured by Jewish avengers and executed secretly. That he lived out his days in some remote location, completely unknown, his true identity never discovered. The truth is that we do not know what happened to Heinrich Müller. We may never know. He was a man who spent his entire career making people disappear, erasing evidence, covering tracks. In the end, he applied those same skills to himself with remarkable success. He became a ghost, a question mark at the end of one of history's darkest chapters. Now let us consider what Müller's disappearance means in the broader context of post-war justice and memory. The failure to find Müller represents one of the most significant gaps in the accounting for Nazi crimes. Here was a man who was central to the Holocaust, who oversaw the Gestapo's reign of terror, who signed orders condemning thousands to death, and he simply walked away. He never faced a tribunal. He never answered questions. He never had to look his victims in the eye and account for what he had done. If he survived the war, he lived out his remaining years in freedom while millions of his victims lay in mass graves. This failure matters for several reasons. First, it represents a failure of justice. The Nuremberg trials and subsequent prosecutions were meant to establish the principle that those who commit crimes against humanity will be held accountable. Müller's escape, if he did escape, undermines that principle. It suggests that with enough cunning and enough luck, even the worst criminals can evade punishment. Second, Müller's disappearance contributed to the mythology of Nazi escape that has persisted for decades. The idea that high-ranking Nazis escaped justice and lived comfortable lives in South America or elsewhere became a cultural touchstone. It inspired novels, films, and television shows. It fueled conspiracy theories that sometimes overshadowed the actual history. The search for Müller became part of a larger obsession with Nazi fugitives that continues to this day. Third, and perhaps most importantly, the uncertainty about Müller's fate meant that valuable historical information was lost. Müller knew more about the inner workings of the Nazi terror apparatus than almost anyone. He could have provided testimony about how decisions were made, who gave orders, and how the machinery of genocide actually functioned. He could have named names and revealed secrets that died with him. If he was interrogated by American or Soviet intelligence after the war, those interrogations might contain invaluable historical information. But if such records exist, they have never been made public. The search for Heinrich Müller continued for decades after the war. Simon Wiesenthal, who dedicated his life to tracking Nazi war criminals, maintained a file on Müller and investigated numerous leads. The West German government periodically reopened investigations when new information emerged. Israeli intelligence kept Müller on their wanted list. Journalists and researchers followed tips and rumors across multiple continents. None of it produced definitive answers. In 2013, a German historian named Johannes Tuchel announced that he had found evidence suggesting Müller died in Berlin after all. According to Tuchel's research, Müller's body was buried in a Jewish cemetery in Berlin in 1945, along with other Nazi officials. The burial was carried out by forced laborers who did not know or care about the identities of the bodies they were interring. Tuchel claimed to have found documentation supporting this conclusion. However, other historians have questioned his findings. The documentation is fragmentary, and no physical evidence, such as DNA testing of remains, has confirmed the identification. The mystery, in other words, continues. Let us also consider what the Müller case tells us about the challenges of historical investigation. Finding the truth about events that happened nearly 80 years ago is extraordinarily difficult. Witnesses die. Memories fade. Documents are lost or destroyed. The deliberate deceptions of the Nazi era created multiple layers of confusion that researchers are still trying to penetrate. Müller was an expert at creating false trails and destroying evidence. Even after death, his tradecraft continues to frustrate those who seek the truth. The passage of time has also changed the stakes of the investigation. When Nazi hunters first began searching for Müller in the late 1940s, there was a real possibility of bringing him to justice. He could have been captured, tried, and executed for his crimes. By the 1960s and 1970s, the goal had shifted somewhat. Even if Müller was found, he would have been an old man. Justice would have been delayed, but perhaps still meaningful. Today, Heinrich Müller would be over 120 years old. He is certainly dead. The question now is purely historical. What happened to him? Where did he go? How did he live out his final years? These questions matter for the historical record, but they no longer have any practical implications for justice. Now let us examine the legacy of Heinrich Müller and why his story still matters today. Müller represents a particular type of evil that we must understand if we are to prevent its recurrence. He was not a ranting ideologue like Hitler. He was not a sadistic monster who enjoyed inflicting pain. He was a bureaucrat, a professional, a man who did his job efficiently regardless of what that job required. He showed that ordinary administrative competence, applied to evil ends, can produce catastrophic results. The Holocaust was not carried out only by fanatics and sadists. It was administered by filing clerks, railway schedulers, and police officials who approached mass murder with the same diligence they would have applied to any other task. Müller also represents the limits of post-war justice. Despite massive efforts by multiple countries, many Nazi criminals escaped punishment. Some lived comfortable lives in South America. Some were protected by Cold War allies. Some simply disappeared, like Müller himself. The myth of comprehensive justice at Nuremberg has been challenged by the reality of widespread escape and evasion. This is an uncomfortable truth that we must acknowledge if we are to learn from history. Furthermore, the Müller mystery reminds us that history is not always neat and conclusive. We want clear endings. We want to know what happened to the villains. We want justice and resolution. But history often denies us these satisfactions. Sometimes the villains escape. Sometimes the truth remains hidden. Sometimes we are left with questions that may never be answered. The case of Heinrich Müller continues to generate new research and new theories. Archives that were closed for decades have been partially opened. Descendants of people who may have known something have come forward with family stories. Advances in forensic technology offer the possibility, however remote, of definitively identifying remains if the right grave is ever found. A few researchers' final secret may never be revealed. What are we to make of this mystery after nearly 8 decades? Perhaps the most important lesson is that evil does not always meet a satisfying end. The Hollywood version of history would have Müller captured, tried, and executed, his crimes exposed and punished for all the world to see. Reality gave us something different. It gave us uncertainty, ambiguity, and the uncomfortable possibility that one of the worst criminals of the Nazi era lived out his days in peace. But if Müller did escape justice in this world, he did not escape history. His crimes are documented. His victims are remembered. His name is synonymous with the worst abuses of state power. Whether he died in the ruins of Berlin or lived to old age in some distant refuge, Heinrich Müller cannot escape the judgment of history. He was a monster. He served monsters. And the world will never forget what he did, even if we never learn exactly what happened to him. The search continues. Somewhere, perhaps, a document molders in an archive, waiting to be discovered. Somewhere, perhaps, a grave holds remains that could finally be identified. Somewhere, perhaps, the answer to one of history's greatest mysteries lies hidden, waiting for the researcher who will finally piece together the truth. Until that day, Heinrich Müller remains what he has been for nearly 80 years. The Gestapo chief who vanished, the Nazi who got away, the ghost that haunts the unfinished history of the Second World War.